Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And, yes, hello. It's the Spooky Lakes book, and this thing is huge. I did not expect it to be this big, face-wise. But I couldn't help myself starting that way. But yes, this is the book that was written by that cool lady on TikTok who makes videos about spooky hydrology. And it's a pretty, somewhat spooky book. This book is a non-fiction for 8 years old and up, and it's about the odd, disturbing, and unusual lakes across the world. It covers a wide range of spookiness. Sometimes it's a chemical makeup of the water, sometimes something we humans did to the ecosystem, sometimes it's a place where people died, and sometimes it's just an odd-looking lake. And the book talks about shipwrecks, natural disasters, death, and brine. And it's got beautiful, full-page illustrations and lots of interesting facts. And I liked it. It's a really fun read. There are some really dark events mentioned, but we aren't getting the kind of specific descriptions that would make things really scary or gory. I agree that the topics covered would be fine for as young as 8 years old. There are mentions of human and animal death, and even disconnected explanations of how someone would die in that lake that go into not minute detail, but it explains the steps. And the thing is, when we get that sort of in-depth explanation of what would be happening to the body, we don't get names or specific cases of it happening. So it's treated as if, like, if someone fell in this lake, this would happen to them. Which in my opinion is a really good thing, because it gives that separation that you need to not make it quite as emotional. It allows you to think of it in the scientific way without, like, you know, mourning the death of strangers who you never knew. And the stories that do involve actual people who actually died, everything is kept pretty mild. Like, it just says someone drowned, or they froze, or whatever. But that's it. Like, personally, I was really happy that in the hot springs, Yellowstone hot springs chapter, Geo did not include the case of the guy who jumped into a hot spring to save his dog, because that case would have been way too heavy for this book. The closest we get here is there's a guy who refused to evacuate before Mount St. Helen erupted, and literally it's just stated that he and his 16 cats died. And hell, the book doesn't even use the word died in that case. It is literally, they met their end. So content-wise, I'd say, yeah, this is perfectly safe for children as young as 8 years old. I do wonder if maybe some of the chemistry that comes up might be a little bit beyond small children. Like, the book does not shy away from using technical terms and technical explanations of what is literally happening. And yes, some of those terms are, or most of those terms, are almost always explained immediately, and there's a glossary in the back in case you missed the explanation, but I did have to read a few of those explanations a couple of times to really understand what it was saying in a way that, you know, made it make logical sense to me. And, now does that mean that, like, most 8-year-olds will have to do that? I'd say most, but are there 8-year-olds out there who would understand this book a hell of a lot better than me? Yeah, of course there are. There are plenty of 8-year-olds who know a hell of a lot more about chemistry than I do. But I do feel like a lot of 8-year-olds are not really going to understand the explanation of, for example, how natron develops. But I do know there are some children who would love it, as well as children who would likely read it and immediately run to their parents going, hey, I need more explanation of what adipocere is, for example. And I do think that most parents would be sitting there going, I don't know what adipocere is, I can't help you, Jimmy. You're gonna have to look that up online, and that might not be good. But the good news is, there are website resources in the back, so if little Jimmy does want to know more about it, he can just go look it up on those websites, which, you know, are going to be scientifically accurate and, you know, not risk taking kids to awkward, weird places. But I also think that Geo was basically walking a very delicate tightrope here, because, yeah, she's famous on TikTok, and at least from what I've gathered from looking at her comments, the majority of her audience seems to be either old teenagers or adults. Like, her comments are not filled with little kids. And this book is primarily for young readers. So she sort of had to write a book that was going to be equally entertaining for adults and children. And especially when you're doing something educational, that's just going to be hard. Because, of course, little children and adults have vastly different levels of education. Or at least we hope they do. But, like, whenever I'm reading something for kids, I always try to think about, like, would I have liked this at the target age range? Do I think the students I used to teach would like this? And would my nephew like this? And I think definitely 100% he would love this book. But he is also very much into science, into facts, and into, learning stuff. I know I would have loved it, except for the mention of cat death. That would have really upset me. But I do think a lot of my students would not have been as into it once we got into the in-depth science. I think some of the science would have been a little bit beyond them. I do also know that even at 8 years old, my nephew would have looked at some of the explanations in the book and gone, yeah, I already know that. Like, that's obvious to me. But also, that kid knew more about some science topics than I did when he was, like, 6. So that's not, a good metric. But also, I would guarantee you there's a lot of stories, a lot of facts, a lot of random details in here that I bet he's never heard in his life. And that's really the joy of niche educational books, but also the downside of niche educational books. Basically, they have to explain a lot of things to try to capture that wider audience, but someone who's at all into that niche will already know all those things. And the niche of this book calls for in-depth explanation of geology, volcanology, and chemistry, which, if you're into those niches, some of the explanations in here will already be stuff you know. But overall, my ruling here is, yes, I think most kids would love this. Some younger ones might need an adult to read it with them and explain a few things, but I also feel like this would be a really fun book to read together with kids. There are all the pictures you can stop and admire and discuss. There are little excerpts that you can talk about. It reminded me a little bit of the old Magic School Bus books. And I do think there are some kids who might be both too old and too young for this book. Because, like, I don't know about y'all, but I definitely hit a phase where I was suddenly like, oh, I don't want to read anything that's for little kids anymore. I'm getting older now. I'm not going to read anything with simple language or anything that explains stuff I already know. And I would dismiss a lot of books as kids' stuff. And there are some explanations in this book that I suspect anyone who is, above 12 is going to be thinking that's kids' stuff. But if they just get past it, I guarantee you there'll be a lot in here that they don't know. And, like, truthfully, I hit adulthood and was immediately like, I don't care if some of this is aimed at kids. There's stuff in here I don't know. It's interesting. I'm here for it. And as an adult reader, yeah, there's just a lot of interesting facts in here. There's a lot of interesting stories. Some of the stories get a little bit more explanation than Geo has time to cover on TikTok. Some get a little bit less, while the book focuses more on a different aspect of what's going on. I will say, I don't think there are any lakes in here that are absolutely just not covered on Geo's Spooky Lake Month episodes on TikTok, but unless you are watching them all on repeat, you will definitely come across some new haunted hydrology in here. I will also say there are a couple of pages that sort of came across as a little bit more a list of cool facts than a single coherent chapter. But a lot of them were also the ones that needed a lot more science to explain what's making the lake spooky. And so it's just going to feel a little bit more textbook and a little bit less narrative. There's also the art, which I've mentioned a couple times, because it's really pretty. Like, a lot of it, like, is nice and spooky. This one was one of my favorites. And it's worth looking at. It's the kind of art you will want to stop and just sort of stare at for a minute. And also, Geo hid little tiny ghosts in a lot of the pictures, so you can have a lot of fun hunting out the ghosts. And some pages have more images, some definitely have less, but there's only 2 places in the entire book where I actively wanted more. We get a lot of explanation in the Lake Superior chapter about like where things are happening on Lake Superior, but we don't have an actual map of Lake Superior in the book. And I was just craving it desperately, like with X marking the spots of where there are the shipwrecks, where there are the different isles. I just wanted to see that. And the other one was the chapter on Lake Karachi, or Karachi? I don't know, I'm not always good at pronunciation, but the author's note in the back of the book specifies that there literally just aren't a lot of source images for that. So Geo was sort of making stuff up as she went along. And I get it. I just wanted a little bit more imagery on that page. The only other thing about the book in general is I would like to say I just want more. Like, I really enjoyed this, and I admit it's a good length for the kind of book that it is, especially considering it is at least partially aimed at younger readers. Having it be much longer would probably be too much. But because I do follow G on TikTok, I know there are so many more spooky lakes, and I just wanted to see more of her art and read more of the details. But that also would have made the book significantly more expensive, so probably in the end it's better at this length. And I don't really know what else to say. I'm not as good about talking about nonfiction because there's not a narrative to break down and there aren't characters to break down. But there is a thesis in this book, like there is themes and stuff like that, but it's not super aggressive about it. It's not one of those books that has a narrative theme that it comes up constantly over and over again. Like, yeah, this book is about respecting our environment and being aware of the damage we can do and that we cannot undo. But it's not on every page. The book isn't rubbing it in your face. There are just a couple lines here and there. And of course, the choice of which lakes to include does play into the theme, but otherwise, it's really just a book of lakes and explanations of what makes them slightly spooky. 10 out of 10 spookies.